Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt of Sew on the Go, and this is Tutorial Tuesday. This week, week 13, we're going to cover bindings. We're going to put on a traditional binding. There are numerous ways of doing it. I'm going to cover the way I do it. If there's nothing else that happens in this series, I will at least have put bindings on my quilts for the next couple weeks. Those of you who know me know that it's probably my least favorite part of quilt making, although I have to say, with the more research that I'm doing, I'm finding some pretty interesting ways and different shall we say, embellishments that you can put in your bindings that will bring them up a notch. So I'm going to be covering a few of those over the next couple of weeks. But today we're going to start with basics, putting on a basic binding. So I'm going to give you a couple of my tips. I love using the binding babies. These aren't as readily as available as they used to be a couple of years back. If you're interested in them and you can't find them somewhere else, reach out to me. Send me an email. I'm going to look to put together a pre-order and get some in because I adore them. So I'm going to show you how these work. If you don't have a binding baby, consider using a paper towel roll or toilet paper tube. The inside, they work great with clothespins. So fabulous tool there. I also, I'm going to be putting the binding on my Timeless with a Twist that has been done for years and quilted for almost a year. So, talks to you a little bit about how much I love bindings, right? But this is going to get me through them. So, I like to cut my bindings and I just put it together with a little ribbon when I'm actually cutting out my quilt. If it's a sampler quilt, I will put it aside. I typically will cut it and put it aside when I'm putting my quilt together. So as I'm cutting fabrics for sashing or the alternate block, bindings, inner borders or borders, I typically will go ahead and cut my binding at that point. I put a little ribbon on it and I put it in a drawer that I keep all my bindings, since that's the most difficult part for me to get to. So I have it readily available. This one here I cut lengthwise because I was cutting this inner border here and I wanted it, since it was a floral, even though it was a small print floral, I wanted it to be lengthwise. I went ahead and cut my lengthwise grain binding strips, which is going to be great because it's going to give a little added strength to the quilt. It will also have me stitching less interchanges. So if you want to figure out about how to determine how much binding to cut, make sure you check out week 12. I cover that in detail for a traditional border, which is what we're going to cut today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to reposition the camera as we walk through the steps. So I hope you'll stay with me. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to attach the binding strips. So you may have 4, you may have 5, you could have 6. However many you have, you want to make sure that you have a straight edge. These came from lengthwise strips that I used for a border. So you can see here that I tore it when it was a large piece of fabric, but I know it's straight, so I'm perfectly good with that. If you're doing a crosswise grain, you would probably want to clean off your salvage, so give it a nice straight edge. The next thing that I do is on the back of the strips I'm going to be attaching. So I have one strip, my first strip, that doesn't need anything, but thereafter I need to come across. So when I put these two together to stitch across, which is typically how I put them together, I do not go across the straight, I go on the diagonal. I like to draw a line. I don't like to wing it. So to do so, I just really take any ruler that has a 45-degree line and I go ahead and I line it up with the top of my strip and I come across. And so that's how I go about marking my strips. Nothing fancy. There are a couple tools out there that will help you. But for this, I can just use my ruler that I have. So then I go ahead and I do use a foot that I can see the needle to attach my strips, just as if I was making half square triangles. I go ahead and put it in a needle down position. I'm going to line up my two edges, right? So along the top and along the side here, matches the strip underneath it. You could pin if you would like. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew across that line that I've drawn. I did bring down my stitch length to 1/5 because the bindings of our quilt really take the abuse. Alright, so now I go ahead and I take this and I kind of flip it over, and then I'm going to bring up my next strip, which I've already pre-marked. I'm going to line that up and come in here, and I just chain stitch them. And then because I did lengthwise, I only have 4 strips here to attach. So again, flip this over. You do have to be careful to make sure you don't twist and turn them. Ask me how I know. Right. We've all had to undo 1 or 2 of them, right? Alright. And then this is my last one here. Another perk of doing lengthwise strips, lengthwise borders, is that you don't have as many to attach. Alright, I'm going to take this over to the pressing and show you how I prepare it to be placed on. Alright, so now that I have them sewn, I'm going to go ahead and take them apart, although I will admit that I try and keep them all up on my ironing table for a bit, because I want to go ahead and trim them. I just eyeball it. I trim it to 1/4 of an inch. And then I want to press those open. So first I want to set my seam. Scoot a bit here. And you can use your pressing stick. Alright, so I'm just going to finger press. Come here, give it a little steam. Nice and flat seam. I'm going to do the same here, set my seam. Finger press. Press. And I have one more over here. See the joy of keeping it all up on top? Okay. Alright. So that's it for the pressing open. Now I want to press them in half. Right? So kind of a little mess here, so I try and get it all on one side, which will be a little off camera, but basically I pile it all in a little pile off the side. And then I like to give it a little best press, just a mist, and then I'm going to go ahead and fold it and work my way down. So, alright, so we give that a nice press. So the lengthwise strips, They don't have as much stretch, which is nice. Your cross grain won't have as much either. Your biased would definitely. So doing this step with a bias strip, you're going to want to be careful. All right, so now what I do with my little bobbin baby is I go ahead and put this in, and then I'm going to start wrapping it. If you don't, as I said earlier, you could take, I used to use a toilet paper insert, you know, the inside of a toilet paper, and roll, and a binding clip, and that worked really well too, but she works phenomenal, and she's cute. But as I said, they're a little harder to find these days. I was able to contact them, and I can put in an order for them if I get a couple requests. They come in all different hairstyles, dresses. They're cute. All right, so I'm just going to continue to press a manageable amount, right? And then I just continue to roll it on. I'll just show you one more hunk, and then I'll finish up. So just keep it manageable. All right, so a little best press. More pressing. Just be careful not to stretch, as I said. If you have cross grain, has a little bit, your bias would definitely have it. But for this quilt, it doesn't have any curved edges, so it is perfectly good to use lengthwise or cross grain. All right, so I'm going to continue doing that, and then we will restart. Okay, so you can see now she's full. This is one of the larger ones. They're small, but I can't see any reason why you'd want a small one. I like the large because this is just a throws binding. Now, I don't wind it tight, nor do I with a toilet paper roll when I did that prior to getting a binding baby. But because you don't want to get it all wrinkly, it's just really to hold her on, and you'll next see how I place her on my machine. Okay, so you can see here, I've taken my binding baby with her binding coming off of her. I have an extra spool holder on the top of my machine, and so I'm just going to slide her on that, and then I'm going to be able to feed this down to my machine to stitch it on. Meanwhile, it keeps it out of my way, and if I needed to, I could pick her up and go take her over to the ironing board or what have you if I need to while putting on my binding. Okay, so first of all, this isn't going to be the easiest thing with my camera next to me, but I'm going to give it a whirl. What I like to do is I like to open up my sewing table so that I have a good long run to let my quilt lay. It gives me room to work. I also put on my 1/4 inch foot, but this is my perfect 1/4 inch foot that allows me, to take my 1/4 inch, take my needle and move it because there's a larger hole here, so it allows for me to move my needle. Of course, I don't have a straight stitch plate on when I move my needle. So I take my needle where it's a perfect 1/4 inch and move it one movement to the left. And that's because I like a binding that's just a hair over a 1/4 inch. I'm using 2 1/4 inch strip that I've prepared and pressed. I like to give myself about 10 extra inches for when I finish. I start about halfway between my quilt. I like to for whatever reason, I guess we all get kind of upset with the corners. So I like to make sure I get to a corner quickly. I also, if I'm using cross grain especially, I like to calculate out and make sure that I'm not going to hit a seam on my binding in my corner. So typically I check to make sure that maybe I'm starting 30 inches from the corner so that I know the seam of a 40-inch width of strip will come around once I get around the corner. All right, I have left my binding in, and I actually have about a 1/4 extra inch of batting on the back here. So I should say I've left my basting in, and I typically will pull that as I go when I'm actually hand stitching down the back. All right, and that's what this binding will be. I'm applying it to the front, and I'm going to hand sew it to the back. So I'm going to give myself about 10 extra inches to come around for finishing, and I'm going to line it up with the edge of my quilt, not that little extra binding that I left there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put my foot down and then my needle down, and I'm going to lock in a stitch. The other thing I like to do is I like to use the machinigers. I think that's how you pronounce it. I've used these for the longest time. I used to use them when I was quilting on my domestic. But here I use them for when I'm putting on bindings. I find that it helps me move the quilt as I'm putting on the binding. So I go ahead and use them. All right, so I'm just going to bring a little bit off my baby bobbin, and I'm going to line it up, and I don't hold it taut, but I hold it pretty close. I don't want it to bring in a lot of extra binding. And then I just start stitching. For this, I do keep my stitch length around 2.5. And I should say, the reason I have the 1/4 inch extra is I usually trim it as I go, but it helps keep the quilt intact while I go ahead and put this binding on and then handle it. And sometimes I need a little extra poof, depending on the binding, so sometimes I leave it in there. It really depends on the thickness of the quilt. All right, so I'm approaching a corner here. I promise not to bore you to tears with stitching this on. But I wanted to get to a corner. All right, so as I approach the corner here, I want to determine a 1/4 inch beforehand, and I typically will go ahead and mark it. So I put on a 1/4 inch on the edge. I hold it taut, well, not taut, but pretty close to taut. I line this up, and I just give myself a little heads up that I'm coming within the 1/4 inch. Again, my foot does it as well. I just like to, here I can see it. I always try and set myself up for success. All right, so I'm going to stitch to there. Okay, I like to take 1 stitch back. Then I go 1 stitch forward. Just locks it in a little bit. Next, I'm going to lift my foot, not my needle, and I'm going to turn this so that I'm going to stitch straight to the corner. So it's a little hard to see, but basically I'm going to stitch right to the corner there. So foot back down, and I stitch out. Again, I don't use my scissors. I know a lot of people who do. All right, so now there's a little bit of a maneuver, especially with the camera being here. All right, so I typically take my gloves off for this next step. I'm going to flip this back, and I give it a finger press. And then what I like to do is I have these corsage pins. I like to use the corsage pin. You could use really any heavy pin to basically keep that fold, right? So I've folded it back. I'm using the corsage pin to give me a straight fold. All right, so you can see here. I don't want extra, but I don't want to shortchange myself. So it's hard to do with holding it up, so let me just fix it here. So again, fold, and I'm using that to keep it straight. And then what I like to do is put a pin in where that fold is. So it kind of lets me know where that fold underneath is. It also keeps it folded. All right, so I put my corsage pin back. All right. So now I'm going to place it under my foot. And I typically have to do this a couple of times, up and down, until I can see the back of my needle. Until I see the needle in the back of this place in the hole in my foot. So I'm going to bring it gently down. I'm going to back up a little. All right. Then I know that I've manually brought my needle down so that I have not hit my pin. I go ahead and take this pin out. I typically put my gloves on next. Or you can put your gloves on after you get past this corner. And then I typically do my locking stitch. So my needle, my pin was back a smidge from where I put my needle. So my lock stitch I know will take a half stitch back. So therefore I know I'm safe to put my locking stitch on. So I go ahead in, and then it takes a step forward. All right, so that just gives a little bit of a lock. And then, wasn't finished, I start my way down to the next corner. So I'm going to keep sewing this, and I will restart my camera when I get to putting them together. All right, well, on my very last side, I've turned my last corner, thank goodness. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's where I get all worked up. So I'm making my way down this last side, and I'm going to keep an eye on where my extra 10 inches is from the start. So typically what I do, and I typically have this in my lap, but I'm trying to make it so that you can see it, is I will go out and put this across, and then I typically take my favorite corsage pin and I stick a pin in it. And that way I know to stop there, right? Because I want 10 inches overlapped in both directions to do my last piecing. All right. And again, this is just the way I do it. I'm sure there are other ways of doing it. But so I have my corsage pin. Try not to put holes in my clothes. Just going to give this a little haircut. This is the downside of not getting your quilt bound earlier. You have all these strings. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this off. And apologies, trying to manage around the camera. It's a handful without the camera. Okay. Keep going. I can see my corsage pin there. Alright, so I'm going to remove it, and keeping everything nice and flat, I'm going to lock in my stitch. Alright, next I'm going to take this over to the cutting table, or excuse me, the pressing table. That's where I find it easiest for me to do this next step. And I'll meet you there. Alright, so I've carried over my quilt to the ironing, I call it the ironing table. It's a big board, the ironing board. And you can see here that I brought my little bobbin baby with me, kept it all organized. She's done her job, terrific job. You can see here basically I have at least 10 inches overlap that I like to work with. It's just my preference. And I leave about 10 inches unsewn. And what I'm going to do now is I like to take my iron and give this, the original, right, the first part of the strip you put down, I give it a little press, and then about midway I fold it back and I give that a press. And then I'm going to do the same with the one that's coming off of my bobbin. I'm going to give it a press, and then I'm going to fold it back actually a 1/4 inch shy, and I can pretty much eyeball this. You may want to measure it if you've not done it. Look at me hitting the poor bobbin baby. All right. And the reason for this is that this isn't sewn down. It's not taut, right? So there's some wiggle room that's going to that we're giving ourselves, this 1/4 inch, that it's going to become tighter as we put it down. All right, next, so you could check this if you want to with your 1/4 inch. I use just a little ruler. Again, there's tons of things on the market for this. I happen to just like my 2.5 inch creative grids. Now, whatever the width of your strip was, that's the distance you're going to want to mark here. And I'm going to mark it halfway onto this strip and halfway onto this strip. So I cut these at 2 1/4. So what I like to do is basically lay down my 1 and my 1 1/4 right there between them. I'm going to go ahead and mark this side, right? And then I'm going to come in 2 1/4 from that line and mark this line. All right, so basically these are 2 1/4 apart, and that's because of the width of my strip, and I have a 1/4 inch gap between them. All right, again, this is the way I do it. I'm sure there are numerous ways out there. Then I just take my scissors and I cut along that line. Bobbin baby is done now, even though she has a little left on her dress. And then I'm going to cut this one. Right, and that can go in the scrap bucket. All right, so now these are basically having a 2 inch overlap, right, because of my 1/4 inch that I cut it short. So I'm sure there's other ways you could do this. This is just the way I do it. All right, so next I'm going to use a basic office binder. I'm sure there's plenty of other things out there on the market. So what I like to do is just pinch this in just to keep it, because I only have a small overlap. So I want to keep my fabric, and I just flip them back down. I want to keep my quilt kind of pinched. Alright, because now I need to do the same overlap that I did in the beginning. Right? So you want to take care to make sure that you are opening these and putting them on top of each other. Okay? So I like to, again, you're kind of working in a tight space. You could leave yourself a little bit more room than the 10 inches. However, you know, you just need to realize that for all the amount that you leave unsewn, that it could get a little tighter, you know, as you sew. So you don't want a lot of extra. All right, so I've got these pressed together. I'm going to take my 45-degree angle, and I'm going to come in here and just mark. All right, and ideally you throw a pin in here as well. To keep it together. And then I'm going to precariously carry this over to my sewing machine and stitch this. All right, I'll be right back. All right, so I went ahead and sewed that. Sorry, that would have been really difficult for me to do with the camera because there's enough judged up in there. But basically, you have to kind of maneuver it under your needle a bit. So I just cut off, again, roughly that 1/4 inch. And now I'm going to go ahead and press this over my stick. So I'm going to first set our seam. The reason you set your seam is so that the thread drops in. One, it gives you flat seams, but two, it drops down and you get a locked in seam. So really important. All right, and then I'm going to press this open. Give it a little steam. All right, and then it should go back to being folded. I'm going to take out my binder clip, right, that was holding my quilt together to give me a little bit of room. All right, and you can see here it's a little taut, and that's what it should be, because when we press, we will press that out. All right, so it will, you know, as it sews, it brings in your quilt there. All right, so let me go sew this. All right, so I'm going to restart where I left off, a couple stitches back. You're going to have remember, it's going to be a little taut because we shortened it that 1/4 inch, but I promise it'll work its way out. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and lock in my stitch. I started a few stitches beforehand. Sorry, keep hitting the camera here. It's a little tight to quarters. All right, so you can see here how it's worked its way in. I'm just going to go past where I started a few stitches, and again, lock in my seam. And I probably will do a couple extra, little back stitch, and a lock again, just to be sure, because I'm capital A. Right, so I'm just going to take this over and give it a quick press, and we'll talk there. Okay, so once I get it all put on, what I like to do is just do a little setting in of the seam, and then just a little quick finger press. so that it helps me when I'm going to tack this on the back. So I just, kind of work my way around, just giving it a little finger press, or excuse me, a little setting of the seam, and then a finger press. It doesn't require much. I just work my way all the way around, typically checking my corners before I start doing my hand sewing. So what I'm checking for is to make sure that my corners will fold back well, and it will. And so I will just keep working my way around the quilt. Well, everyone, that's it for this Tutorial Tuesday. We're going to pick up next week, week 14, on maybe a couple tips on improving your hand sewing. Again, I'm no expert at this. Those of you who know me know it's my least favorite part about quilt making. But I did recently figure out that I have a couple tips that maybe some of you aren't aware of or don't know. So I will cover those in next week, week 14. I did want to let you know that while I was taping, I did get a response back, and I am going to go ahead and do some pre-ordering of bobbin babies. I'm going to list all the different types on my shop, and I'm going to let you pre-order for the next week from airing. And then I will place an order, so it'll be about 2 weeks for them to ship from the time this airs. So, but they're fabulous and they're really difficult to get these days. So I'm going to go ahead and take some pre-orders. And there's so many different types that it's best for me to let you pick which ones you want, and then I'll order those. I also will bring in some of the gloves, and I'll do a pre-order for those. So I'll open both of those up for a pre-order for about a week from the time of airing, and then I'll order them, and it'll take about 2 weeks for them to ship from the time this airs. All right, that's it for this week, so hope to see you next week.